As a regulator, I can't regulate everything that somehow impacts our water in our Chesapeake Bay. But you know, with stewardship and regulation and education and funding and collaboration and volunteers working in partnership, you can do a lot to restore and protect this amazing 64,000 square mile watershed we call the Chesapeake Bay watershed, from Cooperstown all the way down to the tips of the bay in Virginia. It's our home, and as all of you, so I'm not setting aside a lot of time to talk about the facts of the Chesapeake Bay. I'm lecturing to the choir and preaching to you who you know how the Chesapeake Bay is essentially the second largest estuary in the world, and the largest if you look at the land to water ratio. It's all about, it's not just about what we discharge into the water, it's also about how we manage the land and live on the land. And you know, I wasn't the one who said it, but this phrase that the history of the land is written in the water could not be truer than here for the Chesapeake Bay, given its relatively shallow features and the fact that the watershed is humongous. Just the Susquehanna River watershed alone is 27,000 square miles. Obviously, with 18 million people living in this huge watershed, between people and pavement and pollution from different sources, no matter how much we individually and collectively love the Bay, we know that incrementally and cumulatively over time, the stressors are enormous. And so what I want to do is briefly talk about some of the key, I don't want to bore you, I just want to hit on some of the key basic strategies that you're aware of or probably know firsthand that have led to some success, but underscore what has happened in recent years, and underscore also how we're making some really important progress, but nobody is declaring mission accomplished, not even by a stretch. So for me, as an EPA official in 2008, I got to work on the very beginnings of what would become the Chesapeake Bay Pollution Diet, the TMDL, the Total Maximum Daily Load. The joke that is often told at conferences is that TMDL stands for too many damn lawyers. But what it was born out of was a sense that the tributary strategies and the voluntary initiatives and even some of the regulatory initiatives of individual states wasn't going to get the job done. And the growing pressures with nutrient pollution, nitrogen and phosphorus and sediment, there needed to be an invigorated role where the federal government would develop a science-based pollution diet that absolutely would touch on waste load allocations and from point sources and non-point sources, which is the technical term, meaning coming from regulated or unregulated sources of pollution under the Clean Water Act, that we really needed to develop the biggest, most stringent and important TMDL in the world. And the key to that 2010 strategy was that the states voluntarily agreed to have an uber super role of the federal EPA to step in and ensure not that just a pollution diet was developed, but that there were implementation plans, and that they would be measured and followed through on, and that they would involve 4 different sectors. Now, I'm describing 2010, but it's even more relevant right now because we're going through the reassessment of this pollution diet to see how do we get to our goal. And those 4 sectors, which you're familiar with on how they can impact the Chesapeake Bay, not just in Maryland, but from far upstream and west and south of us and east of us. But the 4 sectors are the wastewater sector. And the second major sector is the stormwater sector. A third is the agriculture sector. And then a fourth is the septics sector. And those 4 major sectors were all key components of each and every state, 6 states and the District of Columbia's implementation plans to come up with mechanisms to reduce the nutrient loadings and sediment loadings to the Chesapeake Bay, so that by 2025, with EPA oversight, each of the states could say, we're at 100% implementation of activities, practices to reduce the excess nutrients and sediment, so that the dissolved oxygen levels that measure the quality of life in the Chesapeake Bay is at the level it needs to be to continue to restore and keep a healthy bay underway. And so since 2010, there have been fits and starts. Just from a personal and political standpoint, I would say a highlight for me was in December of 2014, where Governor-elect Hogan decided that he would announce his choices to be the Environment Secretary and the Agriculture Secretary and the Natural Resources Secretary, in essence the Bay Cabinet for the governor. So December 2014, he announced that we would be his cabinet nominees. And in 2015, we started to work on the governor's Chesapeake Bay cabinet. And every governor of Maryland, knowing how Maryland's heart and soul is with the Chesapeake Bay, has a cabinet, a Bay cabinet of different secretaries. We added the Secretary of Transportation, as well as Agriculture and Natural Resources and Environment, not just because of the Port of Baltimore, but also because of the roads and building that the Transportation Department does. And we also included the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science and also the Department of Planning. And this Bay Cabinet to this day advises the governor and the legislature on policies and strategies, not just to make continued progress towards our Chesapeake Bay pollution diet, the TMDL goal, but also on other strategies that focus on things that are very important to Annapolis Green and Lynn and others, and that is plastics pollution or toxics pollution or environmental education and stewardship. And each of the states that's part of the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement that Governor Hogan currently chairs with the other governors is responsible for developing educational, environmental funding initiatives. So over the last few years, what we've seen, particularly over this just past year, is the investments, the regulations, the stewardship practices, the nonprofit leadership, the lead engineering and design steps that are being taken are making a difference. The Chesapeake Bay is seeing some real progress. Now, I know that those of you in the audience, you're on the water, you see from time to time terrible instances of pollution, rollbacks. Nobody can let their guard down. But overall, this world-class scientific organization that is funded by the federal government with state and nonprofit and university support, the Chesapeake Bay Partnership, in close coordination with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation and with other key groups, are tracking measures of health or lack of health. And there's some really good news. And I think whether you're on the water or you just read the newspapers, you hear that there's cause to be encouraged about submerged aquatic vegetation, the secret underwater gardens that breathe life into the bay. We're seeing some real progress there. It's a wonderful thing to get positive feedback. We started getting that positive feedback, and then in a year and a half ago, the Trump administration's budget was unveiled, and it was to zero out the Chesapeake Bay program and to zero out the Great Lakes program and several of the other. They're none quite as good as the Chesapeake Bay program, believe me, but there are other programs that were zeroed out as part of the budgetary jiu-jitsu theater that plays out, and that's a real cause for concern. And what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And so on the political and fiscal point, we're seeing strong bipartisan support. The money is back in. The programs that fund the science and the measuring of progress, not just bay grasses, underwater submerged aquatic vegetation, but dissolved oxygen levels, overall health of the bay watershed, the investment, the public support, the bipartisan support is there. And we'll need to remain vigilant. Governor Hogan has never hesitated to criticize the Trump administration on matters that speak to him and that he knows are priorities for Marylanders. So over the last couple of years, particularly over the last several months, he, on a totally bipartisan basis, has made it clear that we need not just federal funding and support, but that we need all the states to step up. And so as a member of his cabinet, I'm real proud of the fact, and he's very proud of the fact that over the last 3 years he has put record levels of funding into the Chesapeake Bay programs, from the funding for open space, program open space conservation, recognizing that how we manage the land really affects the bay, to funding levels for the Bay Restoration Fund and the 2010 Coastal Bays and Atlantic Bays Trust Fund. So we're looking at over $4 billion over the last 3 years that the Hogan administration has been investing in the Chesapeake Bay. And it provides us with ultra clean hands when we go to Congress or to the administration and say, we're putting up the funding. We need the role of the federal government, not just EPA, but the Department of Agriculture, NOAA, Interior. We need also the role of an interstate umpire. It's not just about the money. It's about having a federal umpire who can oversee the efforts of the states for the Chesapeake Bay TMDL. Are we living up to our milestones? And if not, putting more pressure on them. If we just rely on common law torts and lawsuits, that is the least efficient way to protect the bay. The more effective way and successful way is to have volunteers, stewards, local leadership, state leadership, federal involvement, and to have the Federal Clean Water Act as well as strong state laws ensure that those drivers are there pushing us towards innovation. So the most important point is that in many ways the iconic resources of the Chesapeake Bay, the underwater grasses, we're making progress. The states and the governors on a bipartisan basis are committed to making further progress. Things are looking pretty good. Now here's the challenge, and the not to be a Debbie Downer or a wet blanket, but I'm only focusing on the Chesapeake Bay pollution diet right now. There's so many other measures of overall health of our beautiful Chesapeake Bay watershed the water quality, the sediment, the health of the overall ecosystem. The challenge for the Chesapeake Bay pollution diet, and there's no other diet rigorous roadmap for pollution reduction like it in the world. The challenge for it is that each of the states, all 6 of us, and the district signed up for some pretty heavy lifting. We had a midpoint assessment, which was 2017, early 2018. We're right in the middle of completing that midpoint assessment. Solely from a Maryland standpoint, we're doing pretty well. We need to complete the efforts to install enhanced nutrient removal at a few, like 2 or 3 of those, more than 2 or 3, about 6 of those wastewater treatment facilities. So we're almost there where we need to be on nitrogen. We're pretty much there on phosphorus and sediment. But that's just a midpoint analysis, like a halftime. At the end of the game, which isn't truly the end of the game, we don't just declare victory or loss in 2025. But for purposes of this historic pollution diet, the Chesapeake Bay TMDL, the end point is 2025. And we've got a whole lot that we have to do between now and then. And I'm speaking as a Maryland official. We have a lot. We are national leaders in putting in place fairly aggressive stormwater pollution prevention permits and incentivizing green infrastructure as opposed to the gray infrastructure. We have this amazing dedicated funding for advanced wastewater treatment, the flush fee. We have, or the flush tax, whatever you want to call it. We have other dedicated funds like the 2010 Trust Fund. But we have a long ways to go in order to meet our goals. And Pennsylvania, in particular, has an enormously heavy lift. And there's a great temptation to just simply sue the upstream polluter. And we may end up having to do that. We absolutely may. I mean, we have rights under the law, and sometimes the political jawboning isn't enough. You need additional legal and consent decree tools. But the big challenge that all of the states agree on between now and 2025, and the EPA as well, with all their scientists, I can sum up in 3 basic issues. One is the Conowingo Dam and the Susquehanna River. All right? And it's really easy to demagogue on that because over the past and years past, people who are really concerned that government was going to make stupid investments and try to just keep pumping sand behind the dam forever and ever, and that wouldn't really work. Well, over the last year, the scientific community, the environmental community, and absolutely the governor of Maryland have been saying, no, the actual situation is this. 50% of the freshwater flow to the Chesapeake Bay goes through the Susquehanna River. The last major dam is the Conowingo Dam. And for decades, it has trapped the sediment and nutrient pollution behind it that starts up in New York and goes through the farmlands and suburbs and cities of Pennsylvania. But now that reservoir behind the dam is essentially full. And because of that, and because it has never been dealt with, it's kind of like the dirt has been swept under the carpet of the back steps for so long that now the daily flows of sediment with this phosphorus that sticks to it is no longer being trapped behind the dam. And so the scientists are saying, if you really want to meet your 2025 pollution diet for the overall health of the Chesapeake Bay, you have got to do something in the name of pollution prevention. at the Conowingo Dam, the sediment behind the dam, but also upstream. You know, it's not just about the dredge material, the sediment behind the dam. You've got to invest in ways to reduce the runoff upstream. And so that is one topic that all of the states and the EPA agree on in this midpoint reassessment. How am I doing for time? A few more minutes? Because I'm just now getting to the really good stuff.
Keep going.
So just a month ago, the environmental and agricultural and natural resource secretaries for the 6 states and EPA all agreed that we are going to develop a watershed implementation plan just for the Conowingo Dam itself. We need to shine a spotlight on that, and we need to focus on ways to deal with the sediment and the upstream pollution prevention. And we need to get all of the states to agree to pool some resources, particularly through EPA, but get some resources into overseeing projects that reduce the loadings and also increase and invest in pollution prevention upstream. And one of the reasons that the Hogan administration and that Maryland is so interested in nutrient trading, which some people call pollution trading, and we would say, no, we're going to keep our enforcement tools, we're not throwing anything out, but we need to create some economic incentives for upstream pollution prevention, particularly from players who aren't even regulated by us. And so that area, the Conowingo Dam, the Susquehanna River, is one of the, we will fail. Maryland will not be able to meet its water quality standards for the Chesapeake Bay if we don't deal with that primary and growing source of concern. And that also means that for me, you know, my lifetime as a secretary for the environment is absolutely limited. And for me and for the governor, a lifetime, an opportunity of a lifetime is to negotiate and make sure that the owner of the dam, as it seeks to renew its license, a 46-year license, includes as many safeguards and provisions that they have responsibility for as possible, from fish ladders, fish passage, to flow, managing flow, to make sure they're not just managing flow to generate electricity and revenue, to working with upstream polluters, to dealing with the sediment behind the dam, to finding, where's John? Finding ways to deal with the debris and trash that builds up behind the dam. So that's, of the 3 things I've mentioned, the Conowingo and the Susquehanna together, that is one, and it's a top priority. It's not the only priority, but that is a big one. And the second one is climate change. And on climate change, the basic point is this. All of the states developed pollution diets for nutrient and sediment loadings reductions. What we didn't take into account back in 2010 was the increased precipitation and runoff. And there are a lot of sophisticated models that need to take place to try to adjust that pollution diet. But we're absolutely committed to doing that, and each of the states has signed up saying we're also going to be looking at best management practices that need to be more resilient and focused on climate change. But that's another big item. And then the third one is accounting for growth. You know, nothing is static if you really want to restore a large ecosystem and ensure that it remains protected and restored. And so just like with accounting for climate change, each of the states' jurisdictions is trying to figure out, okay, how is population going to be changing over the next several years? How much pavement? How many farms? How much loss of forest? How much development? And factor that in, try to prevent some of it, try to offset some of it. Those are, I've got a little geeky here getting into the weeds, but between now and March of 2019, when each of the states submits its final targets, revised pollution diets, those are the three biggest issues. But those are all about nitrogen and phosphorus and sediment. I'm not, there's so many other things, particularly for you all as very active environmental stewards, caring about the quality of the water, reducing runoff, embracing environmental stewardship, green building practices. One of the other areas that we need to keep fighting about, but fighting for, is pollution prevention when it comes to litter, trash, plastics. I had the straw in my cup. It's a compostable cup made of cornstarch. Composting is definitely not the only single silver bullet we have, but the more we focus on how is something going to affect the landscape and affect the bay, that's why we need to practice the policies of not just reduce, reuse, recycle, but rethink. And so moving from plastic to paper cups, straws, or using compostable. I met yesterday with an entrepreneur who has a fully compostable plastic bottle. We recognize, and it's a good thing to try to move away from plastic bottles, reusable water bottles. But the reality is we as Americans, as Marylanders, we know that choice, there are matters of convenience, timing. They're going to be plastic bottles. Why not replace the petroleum-based plastic with plant-based plastic? And the answer is that takes some time, develop the markets for that. The good news, though, is that it can develop something that will degrade over time, and you're not only reducing the stress on landfills, but on our local waterways. And also, as many of you read about and hear about, and I know Virginia is following, because there are important laws about marine debris, about sewage, about stormwater, about wetlands protection. How does the Clean Air Act fit into all of this? Well, 20 to 30% of the nitrogen deposition to the Chesapeake Bay is coming from the air. And the Federal Clean Air Act has some really powerful tools. It's definitely not politically convenient for Maryland to be suing suing EPA to enforce the Clean Air Act in 5 coal-fired power plant states, including Kentucky, Scott. But we're doing it.
Thank God for natural gas.
There you go. Well, we're doing it to make a point, and the point is that if those 19 coal-fired power plants in states upwind of us were to run their scrubbers, their controls against smog, during the summer ozone season, when it makes the most sense to do it, it really would make a difference for us in Maryland, in our communities and the Chesapeake Bay. There would be less NOx, nitrogen oxide pollution. So it's a really important reminder that all of these things are connected, kind of like the David White poem, from the air on the land. And the most important part is for people to really care and love the Bay and not demonize others, but to try to find ways to build bridges and partnerships. And that line I love, which fits really well right now when there's all this talk about the wall, that line that if you have more than you need, build a longer table, not a higher fence. Right? And so building a longer table means bringing more partners together, finding ways to protect the land and the precious resources of the Chesapeake Bay, and work together and never lose hope, and keep pushing and developing new tools, and remaining vigilant. And I can't think of a better group to be with right now with those themes than you all. You're on the water, you love it, you care for it, and you're creative and innovative and won't take no for an answer in terms of protecting the Chesapeake Bay. So that's my oh, I forgot, I brought something here. I brought two things. One is just, it is a series of essays. This is for the nerds, and it's about challenges. It was in the Environmental Law Forum, which the Environmental Law Institute put together, and it's just essays, very readable essays. I mean, they're kind of like op-eds, and they're about the challenges, how to protect the Chesapeake Bay. And then the last thing, since I didn't have I'm proud of the fact that I didn't have a PowerPoint, and you should be too, is in terms of an audio visual, just as a reminder, I'm speaking to the inner infrastructure nerd in me. This is a cross-section of a steel water pipe that's about 80 years old. And it's testament to the fact that pipes need maintenance and upkeep. And so over time, the rusting out inside the pipe, it's exactly like arterial sclerosis. It's called tuberculation. Now, I'm real hesitant sometimes to show this to people because an immediate response is, my God, I'm going to buy bottled water from now on. What this is a reminder is that sometimes the most important investment a community can make is in its water infrastructure, its wastewater infrastructure and its drinking water infrastructure. And it's not just the capital investment, it's the maintenance over time and the upgrading. And when pipes get old, just like the rest of us, like all of us, problems can happen. And what this leads to is this can also happen in wastewater pipes, and what that really leads to is sewer overflows. But even on the water pipes, this clogging, what it can lead to is a lack of service and also a real fire risk. The fire departments they don't have the pressure in their water pipes. One of the interesting examples of how people who care about the bay or care about their communities need to be focused on stewardship and on infrastructure, and keeping their eyes and ears open and be willing to invest in what's really important. So thank you all very much.
For you. Are you willing to take some questions?
I would be, but people are probably starving.